"End it quickly," came her whispered plea. The war-weary soldier pulled back the fabric and discovered the horrific mark they had burned into her flesh. The rolling hills of Texas. Springtime 1865? 2 weeks since the fighting had ceased. Dawn hadn't yet pierced the leafy ceiling above, though gentle beams filtered through the cottonwood branches in hazy columns. The creek babbled softly, threading between algae-slicked rocks and autumn's forgotten debris. Peace should have settled here, yet Elias Gray sensed danger lurking in the quiet. His mount, an exhausted gelding called Rufus, had halted abruptly at the water's edge, alert and breathing hard. Dismounting carefully, Elias's palm grazed the pistol at his hip. His feet pressed into the soggy ground as he neared the babbling water. That's when he discovered her, a young woman, little more than a wisp, collapsed beside the stream. One limb folded awkwardly beneath her, the other exposed from knee to foot. Her garment was shredded, caked with mud and crimson. Hands torn as though she'd crawled to this spot. Dropping to his knee, Elias called gently, "Ma'am." Silence answered. Leaning closer, he detected the faint rise of her chest, shallow, unsteady. Her flesh felt cold and damp beneath the grime, a deep gash marking her upper leg, vivid and raw. His eyes swept the surrounding forest. Only birdsong and rustling leaves. "I mean no harm," he murmured to her unconscious form. "Need to stem this bleeding." From his pack he retrieved cloth, tearing it in two. Reaching cautiously toward her injured limb, he attempted to avoid startling her. But the moment his fingers touched her torn dress, her form convulsed violently. Her eyes flew open wide and feral. "Stop!" she cried out, voice breaking. "Please, just make it swift." Elias went rigid, hands suspended above her, their gazes locked. In that instant he witnessed something otherworldly, something shattered beyond repair. This wasn't mere terror, this was surrender. "I bring no violence," he said softly. "Simply do it," she breathed. "I cannot bear more suffering." He paused, slowly withdrawing his hand. "I'll harm no one this day," he replied. "You're wounded." "My intention is healing, nothing more." She watched him, trembling. With utmost care, he approached her injury again. "Allow me to see," he requested. "This wound requires attention." This time she didn't resist, though her jaw clenched tight, and she averted her gaze. Gently raising the torn material above her knee, he froze entirely. There, seared into the tender skin of her inner thigh, lay a brand, a single word, inflamed, scarlet, everlasting. Elias felt his stomach lurch. He'd witnessed such marks before. Just once, during the war's final days, when his regiment discovered a makeshift prison beyond Monroe. Mostly women, some breathing, others not. All bearing identical marks. His hands formed fists before he forced them to relax. He studied the girl once more. No tears fell. She didn't even blink. Her expression had gone vacant, like curtains drawn shut. "What name do you go by?" he asked tenderly. She remained mute. "I'm Elias Gray. You're protected now." Still, nothing. He bound the cloth around her thigh with care, noting her winces. Blood saturated the fabric quickly, but pressure would help. "I'm taking you from this place," he declared. The girl offered no response, her eyes drifting closed again, too drained to fight. Elias wrapped his coat around her and gathered her gently into his arms. "Whatever cruelty they inflicted," he whispered while carrying her toward Rufus, "it concludes today." As he rode from the stream, the scar beneath her skirt burned red in the morning light, silent witness to a tale just beginning. The dwelling sat half concealed, beneath gnarled oaks just past the river's bend. Weather-beaten and tilting eastward, it wasn't grand, but offered dryness, shelter, and temporary safety. Elias carried the girl across the threshold and placed her carefully on the bedding near the fireplace. The flames had died during his absence, but he worked swiftly, gathering kindling, striking sparks. Soon warmth began breathing life into the space once more. She hadn't uttered a word since the creek. Her body remained motionless, lips colorless, eyes open yet distant. Even a stray dog might flinch less when he approached with heated water. "And clean fabric. This wound needs cleansing," he said gently. "There will be stinging, a barely perceptible nod. He worked silently, dabbing with care, never meeting her eyes when the skirt required lifting, touching only what was necessary. When finished, he replaced the blanket over her legs and stepped away. She continued observing him, not with interest, only wariness. A cornered creature, uncertain whether this new trap held nourishment or a blade. He moved to the stove, heated a pot of beans with salt, and spooned some into a metal bowl. After letting it cool, he offered her the first bite. Initially, she just stared. "Take your time," he said, voice low, not demanding. Finally, she parted her lips. He fed her each spoonful like a parent would feed an injured child. No conversation. No inquiries, just sustenance, warmth, flame. That evening, he slept in the distant corner, spine against the wall, weapon close at hand. She never stirred, but her eyes remained open well into the darkness. By sunrise, she sat upright, leaning against the post. When he brought water for washing her hands, she initially recoiled, then permitted him to pour. On the third day, Elias sat beside her with an aged comb. "If you'll permit me, I can untangle that mess." She hesitated, then slowly turned away from him. He began at the tips, gently, careful not to pull. Her hair was thick with twigs, dried blood, and accumulated dust. He worked quietly, patiently. As the fire snapped nearby halfway through, she released a long breath, and for the first time, her shoulders dropped slightly. Later that afternoon, he produced a small oval looking-glass from his belongings. Scratched and dented, the kind of keepsake a soldier might carry for remembrance. He placed it beside her on the stool. "Perhaps you'd like to see. You appear better than you imagine." She stared at the mirror for a long while. Then, in one swift motion, she seized it and hurled it against the stone hearth. It exploded into fragments. Elias remained still. Her voice emerged. "I refuse to see her." He nodded slowly. "I comprehend. No sermon, no apology demanded, just quiet acceptance." That night, while he was ladling more beans into their bowls, she spoke again. "My name is Maeve." He looked over. "Maeve," he repeated like it was holy. "That's all I can offer presently." "That's more than I anticipated." She managed something between a sigh and a laugh. They ate without words, but something had shifted. Not in the room, but in the space connecting them. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect it. But when she returned the bowl, her fingers grazed his for just a moment, and she didn't pull away. The path into Bandera was peaceful that morning, bordered by cedar brush and dust, still moist from night's rain. Elias rode slowly, Maeve behind him on the saddle, arms loosely circling his waist. She'd said little since departing the cabin, only nodded when he asked if she felt strong enough to ride. They required medicine. Her wound, though improving, still throbbed, and Elias knew infection could set in without proper salve and fresh bandages. Bandera was a town barely surviving warped planks, shuttered taverns, and weary men who carried the conflict on their backs. The kind of place where outsiders drew stares and gossip clung like flies to sweat. They dismounted near the general store. Elias helped Maeve down carefully. "Stay with the horse," he said. "I'll return shortly." She nodded, pulling her shawl close. The moment he entered the store, her hands began shaking. She kept her head low, eyes scanning every passing face. Then he emerged, a man partially intoxicated, stumbling from the saloon. Thick limbs, greasy beard, eyes like coal, breath reeking of decay. He bumped her shoulder. "Move it!" She muttered quietly, barely audible. He turned, squinted, looked her up and down. Well, he slurred. "And you a recognizable little harlot?" Maeve backed away, but he stepped closer. "Don't remember me?" he hissed. "Camp outside Monroe?" "Oh, I recall that mark." He lunged forward and yanked her skirt's edge. In daylight, the word burned into her thigh gleamed red. Gasps rose from onlookers. One woman covered her child's eyes. Someone whispered, "That's one of them." The man grinned. "Wide. Runaway property," Maeve froze. But Elias was already there. He shoved the man so forcefully he tumbled backward into the watering trough. Before the drunk could rise, Elias struck him once, twice, a third time until blood streamed from his nose. No one intervened. Elias grabbed Maeve's hand. "We're leaving." They rode from Bandera without another word. Back at the cabin, the silence was crushing. Maeve sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Elias tried to speak, but she only shook her head. That night, rain returned gentle at first, then hard and cold. Elias woke with a start to find the bedding empty. He rushed outside. She stood at the river's edge, barefoot on slick stone, dress clinging to her legs, hair soaked, eyes wide. "Maeve," he called. She didn't turn. "I cannot exist like this," she said. "They see me and all they see is that word, that brand, not a person, just something damaged." "You are not damaged," Elias said, stepping carefully toward her. "You survived." She shook her head. "You deserve someone complete." "I want you," he said, voice shaking. "And I won't let you vanish." He reached out just as she stepped forward and caught her. The river surged just inches below. He pulled her into his arms, held her tight as rain soaked them both. She clung to him, sobbing against his chest, and he said nothing, just held her. As long as she needed in the darkness with only the storm as witness, Maeve didn't fall. She was saved. The next time Elias rode into Bandera, he went alone. Maeve had refused to return, and he hadn't argued. After what happened previously, he'd never risk her safety again. But supplies were running low, and part of him wondered if the town had changed, or if it even could. The ride-in was quiet. Texas spring air clung warm to his coat, and Rufus' hooves echoed through empty scrub. But the closer he came to town, the heavier his breathing became. He tied Rufus outside the general store, nodded at the clerk, and handed over the list Maeve had written. The man nodded and disappeared to gather the goods. Elias, needing a moment to clear the dust and bitterness from his throat, stepped into the saloon next door. The room fell silent like a church in mourning. Men stared over half-empty cups. A poker game froze mid-hand. Somewhere near the hearth, a piano player stopped mid-note. War had ended, but suspicion hadn't. Not for a man like Elias Gray. He stepped to the bar, about to order coffee, when he saw him. Behind the counter, leaning with the swagger of someone too confident in their position, stood a man broad-shouldered and graying at the temples. A long scar dragged from temple to jaw like a signature left by sin. And on his chest, pinned high and gleaming, was a tin star. Jonah Bexley. Elias froze mid-step, hands tense, shoulders straightening. He hadn't seen that face in over 2 years, but he'd never forget it. Bexley's eyes found him. For a moment, recognition didn't register. Then it did, flaring like gunpowder. His mouth curled. Well, he drawled. "If it ain't Elias Gray." Elias didn't move. His voice was gravel. "Didn't know Vermin got promoted to law?" Bexley laughed slow and cruel. He poured himself a drink, calm as a cat with blood on its paws. "You look different without the gray coat," he said. "But I never forget the man who destroyed my barracks." Elias stepped forward, his boots echoing like war drums. "You operated a prison for women, not a camp, not a post, a damned slaughterhouse." Bexley's eyes glinted. "Slaves were property. Let's not rewrite history." Fury flared in Elias's chest. "You think marking women makes you a man?" Bexley leaned in, his smile widening. "Still playing hero?" he sneered. "Or did you finally find yourself a pet?" Elias said nothing. Bexley's eyes narrowed, voice turning cold. "Heard a girl's been hiding in the woods, scar on her thigh, fire in her eyes. That wouldn't be my runaway, would it?" The air went thin. Every man in the saloon watched now, waiting. Elias's hand rested near his holster. "She's not yours," he said, quiet as a death knell. "She was never yours. She was marked." Bexley spat. "That makes her mine." Elias took one step closer. "You show up near that property again, and I'll bury you where you stand." Bexley leaned forward, the badge on his chest catching light. "I'm the law here, boy. You shoot me, you hang." Elias didn't blink. "No, Bexley, you're just a coward with a star." A beat passed. Then Bexley hissed, "If you don't kill me now, one day you'll turn around and find her gone because I always collect what's mine." Elias stared at him, fist tight. The room held its breath. Then slowly, Elias turned and walked out, rage in his chest like wildfire. One thing was clear. The war wasn't over. Maeve was still being hunted, and the hunter now wore a badge. The wind shifted that night, cold and sharp, cutting through the trees like a warning. Elias had gone out alone to check the traps near the ridge. Maeve had asked to accompany him, but he'd refused gently. "Stay warm. I won't be long," he had said with a soft smile, but something about the way the air pressed against his back felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath. He never reached the snares. The first blow came from behind, hard and fast, cracking against his skull. He hit the dirt, ears ringing, vision spinning. 3 men surrounded him, faces half covered in kerchiefs, but Elias knew who sent them. One spat tobacco near his head. "Where is she?" the tallest demanded. "Where's the branded whore?" Elias tried to rise, but a boot slammed into his ribs, sending lightning through his side. He bit down hard, blood filling his mouth. "We know she's with you, Gray. The Ixley's got a price on her head, high one." Another kick, this time to his shoulder. Elias laughed, sharp and hoarse. "That why you came 3-on-1 for a girl half your weight?" The biggest one grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against a tree trunk. "We came to give you a choice. Tell us where she is, or we leave you for the buzzards." Elias looked him square in the eye, pain slicing through every breath. "You kill me," he rasped, "and you'll never find her." Then the man punched him in something. Cracked in Elias's side. He groaned, sharp, guttural. The second man raised a length of wood and brought it down across his ribs again. The world tilted, but he never spoke. When they finally left him broken, bleeding, breath wheezing through cracked ribs, they took his boots and left him barefoot in the dirt, hoping the cold would finish what their fists began. He lay there curled around the pain, coughing blood, eyes barely open. The stars swam above him, and then Elias. Her voice cut through the trees, desperate, afraid. "Elias!" Maeve crashed through the brush, breath ragged, face pale with panic. She dropped to her knees beside him. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She touched his face, his chest, his shirt soaked with blood. "You're hurt." "Oh God, I'm fine," he croaked, barely audible. "Just a bit bruised." "Liar!" she snapped, trying to lift him. "What happened?" Bexley's men. "They wanted you." She pressed a trembling hand to his side, felt the heat swelling beneath the skin. Her face crumpled. "Your ribs?" He coughed, tried to laugh. "Only a few, nothing vital." "Why didn't you run?" He looked at her through half-closed eyes, and even through the pain he managed to smile. "Because if they touched you," he said slowly, "I wouldn't be able to live with myself." She shook her head, tears falling freely now. "Stupid," she whispered. "So damn stupid." "I know." She slipped his arm over her shoulder and began dragging him toward the cabin. Every step was a struggle. Elias gritted his teeth, tried not to groan. Blood stained the ground behind them. "You shouldn't see me like this," he said once, halfway. "There. Too late," she answered. By the time they reached the cabin, she was soaked in sweat and shaking. She lowered him onto the bedroll, hands never leaving his body. She peeled back his shirt and hissed at the bruises dark and spreading like ink under parchment. "Stay still," she said. "Do not move." He nodded faintly, breath shallow as she pressed a cool cloth to his side. He whispered, "As long as you're safe, it was worth it." She froze, their eyes met. He was half broken, bloodied, gasping for breath. But not once had he thought of himself. She sat beside him through the night, holding his hand in silence. And for the first time since she'd met him, Maeve began to believe that not all men took. Some stayed, some bled, and some loved without needing to say the word. The forest was still that morning, too still. Even the birds seemed to have held their breath. Maeve had risen early to fetch water from the creek, Elias still sleeping under the weight of healing ribs. She was halfway back when she saw it, the front door swinging open, the bedroll inside. Empty, no sign of struggle, no sound, just gone. Her heart dropped. The world tilted. Then something caught her eye. Boot prints, fresh, pressed deep into the mud from the previous night's rain. At least 3 sets heading west into the trees. She dropped the water pail, sprinted inside, and grabbed the rifle leaning beside the hearth. Elias's revolver sat, untouched on the table, half cleaned, forgotten from the night before. She grabbed it too, checked the chamber. 4 bullets. Poor chances. She followed the trail into the trees, bare branches scraping her arms, breath sharp and fast. The prints grew fresher, disturbed drag marks. Her pace quickened. An hour passed, then 2. Finally she heard it. A voice low, mocking carried through the clearing ahead. Jonah Bexley. She crouched behind a tree, peering through the brush. Elias was on his knees, hands bound behind him, blood trickling from his temple. Bexley paced in front of him, shotgun slung low. 2 other men stood nearby, armed. "You think hiding her makes you a hero?" Bexley spat. "She's a mark, nothing more." "You really think she won't run the moment she sees you limping and broken like the rest of us?" Elias said nothing, chin lifted despite the bruises. Bexley sneered. "Hell, I should thank you saving me the trouble of dragging her back. Maybe I'll let you watch before I cut your throat." Maeve stepped into the clearing. "Take 1 more step toward him," she said, voice clear, "and I will kill you." The men spun around. There she stood, hair wild, dress torn at the sleeves, mud on her boots, but eyes steady, gun raised, a breath from firing. Bexley's grin faltered, then returned crueler than before. "Well now," he drawled, "ain't this something?" The branded bitch shows her teeth. He stepped forward. She didn't flinch. "You going to shoot me, sweetheart? After all we've been through?" His voice dropped to a snarl. "You remember it, don't you? The cell, the ropes, the way you cried when The crack of the pistol shattered the morning. 1 shot straight into his chest." Bexley staggered, blood blooming across his vest. He looked down in disbelief, then fell backward into the dirt. The other men froze. 1 turned to run. The other dropped his weapon and backed away with trembling hands. Maeve kept the gun raised until she was sure they were gone. Then she dropped it. Her knees gave out and she collapsed beside Elias, hands shaking violently. "I killed him," she whispered, staring at the blood. "I killed someone." Elias leaned toward her, even with pain in every breath. "You saved my life." She shook her head, eyes wild. "But what does that make me? What does it mean if I could do it? If I could pull the trigger like that?" He reached for her, bound hands brushing her cheek. "It means you are stronger than what he did to you." She stared at him, eyes filling. "You're not afraid of me now?" He held her gaze. "I have never been less afraid." A sob escaped her lips. "I thought if you saw me like that, you'd see what he saw." Elias leaned close, whispering through pain. "I don't see what he saw. I see the woman who came for me. The woman who walked through hell and stood up to the devil." She lowered her head, pressing it to his shoulder, shaking with relief. "I thought I had lost you. You found me." It was only then she reached behind him, cut the ropes, and pulled him into her arms. They stayed like that for a long time, surrounded by silence and fallen leaves. Maeve had pulled the trigger, but for the first time, it wasn't in fear. It was in love and survival. And she wasn't sorry. The forge behind the cabin was nothing more than a blackened stone pit and an old anvil. Elias had hauled up the ridge with a busted wagon wheel and sheer stubborn will. There was no shelter from the wind, no roof above, just open sky and the steady hiss of hot metal meeting cold air. But it was enough. He stood there at dawn, sleeves rolled, shirt soaked with sweat despite the morning chill, hammer gripped in calloused hands. Every strike echoed through the clearing like a slow heartbeat, the sound bouncing off the trees, waking birds and stirring something deeper. Maeve stood in the doorway of the cabin, wrapped in one of Elias's old coats, arms folded tightly across her chest. She didn't ask what he was making, not with words, but her eyes stayed fixed on him. Watching, listening, waiting. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he moved like a man shaping more than just metal, like he was trying to shape meaning from ruin, trying to craft something that could last. The bullet casing had been in his satchel since the last day of the war. One of the final rounds he'd chambered in the chaos of fire and smoke. He had never fired it. Something had stopped him. Maybe fate, maybe grace. He didn't know why he kept it. Maybe it reminded him of what he'd survived. Or maybe it had always been waiting for this. He placed it gently in the fire until it glowed red hot, then pulled it out with iron tongs, laying it across the anvil. The first strike flattened it with a metallic cry. The next shaped it, then again and again he moved slowly, methodically, turning the shell from a weapon into a ring rough-edged, golden from the brass, warm from the fire. When it cooled, he filed it smooth, polished it with a piece of cloth and ash. No engraving, no stone, just the memory of heat and the promise of what came after. By the time he finished, the sun had risen high over the pines. The air smelled of wildflowers and morning earth. Elias wiped his brow, pocketed the ring, and turned to face the open field. "Maeve," he called softly. She stepped out, coat still wrapped around her shoulders, hair loose and tangled in the wind. He was standing near the edge of the trees where the field gave way to tall grass and bursts of color bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, wild mustard stretching for miles. Spring had finally come to Texas. She walked to him, bare feet brushing. Through dew-kissed blades, he didn't wait. He met her gaze, steady and sure, no fear in his voice. "I was never supposed to make it out of that war," Elias said. "And after it ended, I didn't think there was anything left for me. I was walking through the world like a ghost." Maeve's throat tightened. "But I found you," he said. "Or maybe you found me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring. It glinted faintly in the sunlight, modest, unpolished, forged by hand and memory. "This was a bullet once," he said, voice thick. "Now it's a promise." He dropped to one knee. "Maeve Carter, I know what they did to you. I know what they tried to take, but they didn't take your fire or your grace or your soul." He looked up, eyes shining. "You gave me a reason to live again, to fight for something real. Will you marry me? Will you build something with me that the war couldn't destroy?" Maeve stood motionless, her fingers trembling. She looked down at her hands, still scarred, down at her leg where the brand still lingered. Then she looked at Elias. He wasn't looking at her scars. He was looking at her, the woman who had chosen to survive, to stay, to love. Tears filled her eyes. She smiled. "Yes," she whispered, "yes." Elias slid the ring onto her finger. It was imperfect, forged from ruin, but it fit as if it had always been meant to. She cupped his face in her hands, and when she kissed him, it wasn't just love, it was survival. It was salvation. And in that field of wildflowers under the wide Texas sky, they both knew they had taken what was meant to destroy them and turned it into something sacred. The sunset bathed the hills of Texas in golden rose, casting long shadows across the small wooden chapel on the ridge. The heat of the day had softened into a gentle warmth, the kind that touched your skin like a memory. The air smelled of honeysuckle and dust, the wind whispering through the grass like it too had come to witness something sacred. Inside the chapel, the pews were filled with townspeople, quiet, curious, uncertain. Word of the wedding had spread like wildfire. They knew her name now. They knew the mark she bore. They whispered of the scar of the soldier who had taken her in, of the nights she had been seen buying bread alone, head bowed, of the morning she had walked out of the doctor's office holding Elias's hand. Some came to judge. Others came out of guilt for all the times they had looked away. But most came for the story, the girl branded and the man who never let her go. Candles flickered in the corners. Miss Alberta, the seamstress, sat in the front row, clutching a small handkerchief she'd sewn herself, and then the doors creaked open. Maeve stepped through. She wore a simple white dress, hand-stitched by Elias with clumsy fingers, every seam tugged and redone until it fit. Miss Alberta had helped him with the sleeves, adding soft lace borrowed from an old christening gown. The hem wasn't perfect, a stitch here, a loose thread there, but it was beautiful in the way only something earned could be. Her hair was pinned back with wildflowers, bluebonnets, Queen Anne's lace, and a sprig of lavender behind her ear. Her eyes, once darting and guarded, now held stillness. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of someone who had made peace with being seen. Her walk was steady, back straight, shoulders proud. The scar on her thigh showed beneath the slit of the dress. She let it. She did not hide it, and no one in that chapel looked away. A little girl scattered petals at her feet, laughing with delight. She didn't know the weight of what she was honoring, but somehow she carried it all the same. The room held its breath. Then someone clapped, a single pair of hands, then another, and another, until the room swelled with applause. Not for beauty, for bravery, Elias stood at the altar, clean-shaven for the first time in months. His shirt was freshly pressed, his boots polished. His ribs still ached with every breath, but he stood tall. He had never looked more like a soldier and less like a man at war. His eyes never left her. When Maeve reached him, she smiled. "You did this," she whispered, barely audible. "So did you," he answered, just as quiet. The preacher began the ceremony, voice steady. But for most, his words blurred beneath the hush of hearts being rearranged. When it came time for vows, Elias took Maeve's hands and turned to face the crowd. "I want you all to see her," he said. "Not the mark, not the pain, not the past." He looked back at Maeve, his voice steady, sure. "She is not the girl they tried to break. She is not the thing they tried to brand. She is the woman who survived. And she is not someone's property, she is someone's hope." Then gently, he slipped the brass ring onto her finger. It was imperfect, shaped from an old bullet casing, but it was hers, forged from fire, from choice, from love. Maeve blinked back tears. Her lips parted, but words failed her. There was no need for words, only breath, only love. When the preacher gave them permission, Elias kissed her slowly, carefully, reverently, and the chapel erupted. Cheers, applause, quiet tears. Whispers filled the air. Maybe Grace still lived in Texas. They walked out hand in hand into the light of the setting sun, her dress catching the breeze, the scar visible like a flag never lowered. Outlaws may have once ridden these hills, but that day it was a different kind of legend being written. Later that night, beneath a sky full of stars, as the fire crackled low and the embers glowed like tiny suns, Maeve sat beside Elias, lost in thought as she stared into the flames. "I was branded as something broken," she said quietly. "Something used." She looked at the ring on her finger, then at the scar that still lived with her. "But he looked at me like I was something rare." Her fingers brushed Elias's hand. "And, for the first time in my life, I believed it." If Maeve's story touched you, if you believe love can rise from scars and second chances, then you're right where you belong. Subscribe to Wild West Echoes for more powerful frontier romances, where healing runs deeper than blood and love always finds a way. Hit the bell, stay with us, and remember, you're not your past. You're who you choose to become.